At this point, from talking to the county and looking at some of the state numbers, we are exceeding initial expectations. So that's a good thing. And we're potentially on pace to hit turnout from 2010 midterms, which was around 70%, which is very high. 70% of registered voters. That's a high number for midterms.
And there's a lot to dissect and a lot that can be spun both from Republicans and Democrats on what exactly that means. It may mean something different in Washington State versus what it means in, say, Montana, where I also know that the voter turnout already has been strong. So it's been strong across the board nationwide. Really quick, want to just point out that if you're watching here on Facebook, to feel free to submit some of your questions that you may have, and we will try and break them down the best we can here. But there's obviously a lot to talk about on a national level and a local level as well. Natalie has done a significant amount of reporting on the initiatives, which I think a lot of people will be talking about tomorrow.
Right, and I think this is one reason why people maybe were hanging on to their ballots over this final weekend, because on some of these initiatives, they're complex. There's a lot of information to sort through. We've been seeing a lot of ads on the airwaves in support of, opposed to. There's just a lot of confusion to sort through, particularly on the big carbon initiative, a first of its kind carbon fee initiative. So let's put up a full screen and show you some of the
1631, right?
points. This is 1631. We'll show you some of the bullet points of what this measure would do. It would impose a starting fee of $15 per ton on carbon emissions in this state. It would take effect in 2020, and most of the revenue raised, according to the initiative, about 70% would go to investing, building a clean energy infrastructure. The remaining money would go to restoring forests, protecting water, and then also a percentage would go to helping out communities most impacted by climate change. So while the fee would go on emitters of carbon, critics say that the cost is going to be passed down to the consumer. And this is what, I've been talking to a lot of voters, and they are concerned about increased costs because there is something called levy fatigue in Seattle, you know that, and Washington State overall. And this is where it gets confusing because the estimates of how much prices could increase are just all over the map. The yes side, so supporters of 1631, estimate it could cost the average household somewhere from $120 to $180 a year. Critics say it's double that or even more than double. But at this point, we really don't know because we don't know what those big oil and gas companies would pass on to the consumer.
Yeah, and like you said, there's been a ton of money poured into this race. The ad campaigns that we've seen, it's been interesting to see people like Cliff Mass, who a lot of weather geeks like in Seattle and in King County. He's jumped into this debate and said people should vote no on 1631, which has been interesting, I think, just on a kind of micro level in Seattle and King County. So it's going to be interesting to see what those results are like tomorrow.
Yeah, and then on the other side, you have Bill Gates, who jumped into the debate in support of it, has donated money to support the campaign. Interesting to note that this one did set a record for most money raised in an initiative campaign, and it was actually the opposition raising more than $30 million to try and defeat this measure, most of that coming from oil companies, big oil and gas, like BP at the top of the list and all those companies. We have more information about exactly where the money comes from online. But I think one reason, the other, aside from potential increase of cost to consumers, the other concern that folks have about this initiative is while there's a framework for how the revenue raised will be spent, there's not an exact plan. So if people want to know how exactly is this money going to be spent, that plan still has to be created. And if this measure is passed, what happens is a special board will be appointed by the governor. So we don't yet know who will be seated on that board. They will work together in concert with the Department of Commerce, Ecology, and DNR to come up with this grand master plan of, how much money should go to solar versus wind versus lithium batteries. We just, there's so many different possibilities. And in theory, they would have about a year to come up with that plan. Then the legislature would have to approve that plan, and only then would this fee, kick into gear and be imposed. So there's a lot of moving parts and pieces, and some questions about, well, really, what would this look like if passed?
And that's why I think the critics have kind of seized on that point in particular, including Cliff Mass, who talks about climate change and all those kind of things, environmental issues. He's talked about the questions about just how this would be set up on a state level, and,
right,
and whether there needs to be more regulation of a initiative like this.
Right. The critics saying, where's the accountability and oversight? But what's interesting to know, I talked to a researcher who's in support, a clean energy researcher at UW, who is in support of this measure, and he argues that the flexibility is actually a good thing, because his argument is that the technology is changing so rapidly. Well, it's good that there's not already a plan, set in stone that allows them to be more flexible and adapt to what would be best suited to help, cut down carbon emissions.
Well, I'm looking at the Facebook comments, and a lot of people are saying they're voting all red or they're voting all blue.
Right. This is something we've been seeing all season long.
And drop off your ballot, by the way. A lot of people asking about mailing at this point. If you have a chance to drop it off, we expect a big line tomorrow at King County elections as well.
Right. Well, what's interesting when you're noting those comments on Facebook, it does seem like when it comes down to the individual party races, people are certainly in their camps, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing in big congressional races like the 8th District, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But then when you get to these initiatives, I mean, there is, for some folks, a gut reaction, yes or no, based on their passion level for a particular issue, or, if it has to do with taxes, there's kind of maybe a visceral reaction to that. But then there's a lot of gray area where people, irregardless of party, they could vote different ways on different initiatives just based on some of the information or conversations they're having with their, family or fellow voters.
Well, you've done some report on these other initiatives as well. 1634, which is the grocery initiative, that's how it's being labeled on a statewide level. I think a lot of people like you have seen that this really came out of the soda tax discussion in the city of Seattle, and whether soda should be taxed. And we've seen Big Soda, as it's been referred to, come out in force against this initiative. What do you see with this one, 1634?
Yeah, this will be interesting to see. And to get a bit wonky, it really has to do with a provision in state law that has to do with the privilege tax, which allows local governments like Seattle City Council to tax distributors on certain items. So this isn't like a sales tax on grocery. This is a tax on distributors, which is how the Seattle soda tax came to be. And I think people are asking, well, we don't yet know the impact exactly of the soda tax. We know Seattle has commissioned a study, which is not yet out, right, to measure some of the health impacts and potential cost impacts. And so what the impact of a soda tax is really varies depending on which side you're talking to. Right. And the yes side would argue that, well, just because, we know there was a soda tax, and opponents say that groceries would never be taxed. The supporters say, well, what's not to say that some city council somewhere in Washington state wouldn't, decide to tax a distributor of another item outside of soda. But where is the money coming in from? It's definitely big beverage corporations funding the yes side. But then when you look at that broader coalition, it is a lot of local unions, small businesses. It does have quite a long list of supporters. Yeah,
and the soda company is probably looking at this point, Big Soda, for lack of a better description. Philadelphia has gone through the soda tax discussion. Berkeley, other municipalities are discussing it. Potentially Seattle starting something bigger, just based on the discussion that we saw in the city of Seattle. And I think that's where we started to talk about this state initiative process. And it'll be interesting to see just, I think, how this is framed in the voter's guide for some people who may not be paying as close attention as you or I, just how that translates tomorrow.
Right, and based on the ads, whether or not they think they're, the yes side is being deceptive, because the money points to soda, but the ads are all about groceries.
Right.
And that's rubbing some viewers or voters the wrong way
Right.
from talking to folks. They're saying, wait a second, are they trying to trick me because they're saying it's all about groceries, but other people are saying it's about soda? What is it about?
Right. Looking at Facebook real quick before we move on to another initiative. Let's see what people are weighing in with. Oh, Roberta says, make the liar political commercials go away. I may sue.
Yeah.
There's
been a time.
Yeah, a lot of people saying which way they're going to vote and whether they're going to go red or blue. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see tomorrow. If you have a question about any of the particular races, let us know while we're here on Facebook Live. But a couple more. Yeah, guns, 1639.
Yes, and we've been talking about this one for a while. As you know, this is an effort that actually failed in the state legislature. Lawmakers in Olympia were talking about it, but it did not get a vote. So now we have a citizen initiative that's an extremely comprehensive, seen as maybe the most comprehensive gun measure to date in Washington state. It would raise the age to purchase a semi-automatic rifle from 18 to 21, which is currently the age needed to purchase a handgun, and then also bring enhanced background checks to those same weapons, similar to what's required for handguns. And it would also create a new law for safe storage. So this is kind of a two-part initiative that a lot of gun rights supporters are saying this goes too far.
Hasn't the spending been interesting on this too, that gun rights supporters have not spent what a lot of people expected them to in order to get their message out?
Yeah, but compared to the other initiatives, this is not on the big money side of things. Even the yes side, across both sides, I will say that it is much more grassroots, because this is also an issue where people are very impassioned across both sides, and maybe they feel like they would rather do email blasts or go door to door instead of spending millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars on big ads, because we really haven't seen, we've seen maybe one ad by the yes side, but this has been way more of a grassroots campaign, and also more of a conversation that we've been having in our country for a while, right?
Yeah.
Over the past year, if you think of all the times that we've talked about gun violence and gun safety measures, gun control, and so maybe it's more on the minds of voters, and there is less of a need to flood the airwaves with advertising, which is the more expensive part of a campaign.
Yeah, it could be interesting just based on how this city or how this state lays out, left-leaning Seattle with the population center and the rest of the state. Obviously, as you know, two different sides of the coin here. People in Eastern Washington have tended to feel another way about gun rights and gun safety. So,
but it's the population in Seattle that can carry some of these initiatives and make this a state law for the entire state of Washington.
So I think that'll be something interesting to watch. Just again, checking on Facebook real quick before we move on to police. Let's see, are there any questions? No, just people saying what their favorite color is. So we'll continue to monitor that as well.
The fourth big initiative is de-escalate Washington. That's I-940, and this would change the standards of for use of deadly police force in Washington state. As you know from our reporting on this, currently it's very difficult to prosecute police officers involved in deadly use of force incidents. It has to do with state statute and a good faith standard and the use of the word malice. So this would change that statute. It would also create an independent investigation group that would look into use of force incidents instead of the department investigating itself, essentially, and would require additional mental health and de-escalation training statewide. What's interesting about this one is, the unions. This is, if you just look at Seattle, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this. Mayor Durkin came out on, Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkin came out on Friday in support of this initiative and basically said the city of Seattle stands behind this initiative. The police union, SPOG, does not, right? So this kind of pits the mayor against the police union and some of the other police guilds that have concerns. You know, even if they agree that something needs to be changed in the law, they want to be at the table to help write the new statute.
Right. And I think Durkin probably is reading the tea leaves in Seattle, and knowing that some of the campaigns have involved the family of Charlene Lyles, Jim Pugel, who is a former Seattle police officer. There's been some written about him supporting this. I think the mayor is probably reading the tea leaves and knowing how Seattle's going to vote. Now, there's a question of how the rest of this state will vote, as we just discussed. But that'll be something worth watching tomorrow, as well. Just to segue right into Prop 1, the levy in Seattle. The big family and education's levy, $620 million. It's actually an extension of a levy, but also a property tax increase. Really has not been any sort of organized opposition to this, and Seattle has also shown a propensity to vote for any sort of major education levy, whether it's a local school district levy or in this case one that would help out preschool, early childhood education, as well as the Seattle Promise. This has been a big thing for Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkin. She ran on it. Actually, her really first big piece of legislation, bringing it to the voters. The subtext in all of this, I like to go back to a few months ago when there was all this talk about the head tax, and that was going to be on the ballot, most likely, if the signatures came together.
Right. Yep.
This would have been tied into that. It could have been a big election about taxes in Seattle. Instead, we're only talking about this one. And
do you have any sort of gut instinct on how this one goes?
I think you look at the signage around town, you look at the coverage of this issue around town. It's hard to think that the voters will go against an education levy in Seattle. We've asked the question now for about 5 years. When will Seattle feel taxed out? When will Seattleites actually vote against a property tax levy or tax increase? I'm not sure that's going to be this one tomorrow.
And it'll be interesting to see how it compares to some of the other tax-related measures on the ballot, and if there's some sort of, you know, divide between Seattle voters and other parts of King County even.
Again, people are going to, we could talk about this tomorrow. By the way, we're going to do a digital show from 8 to 9. We got to tell you that. We'll talk about this tomorrow at length, but you know, the McCleary decision increased property taxes in Seattle, King County. Right. Elsewhere, you have this levy on the ballot tomorrow, and 2 Seattle school district levies next year in February. So 4 potential property tax increases in a little bit more than a year. At some point, people are going to open up those bills and say, hey,
well, they're already, we know that they're already doing
we know that they're doing
so
that, especially after Sound Transit 3.
What is the threshold?
Yeah.
So these are some of the big issues and measures. Then, of course, we're going to be all eyes on Washington's 8th congressional district. Even though there's a good chance we may not be able to declare a winner for days, if not weeks. I mean, both sides already not ruling out the possibility of a recount.
Well, yeah, the question is what will be decided by the time we get to 8 o'clock tomorrow night here on the West Coast, and will we hear about which way the House and the Senate is going to go by the time we get to that 8th district race. And then we'll see just how much fun we'll have here in the days to come.
People watching this Facebook probably know, but we're talking about the open seat race for Republican Dave Reichert's seat. This is the race between Republican Dino Rossi, former state lawmaker, former statewide candidate, who knows a thing or two about recounts. And Democratic Dr. Kim Schreier, who's a first-time candidate and an Issaquah pediatrician. So they've been out, you know, pounding the pavement all weekend long, having canvases all over the 8th district, which is a huge, expansive district covering portions of 5 different counties on both sides of the Cascades. So they've had to travel from eastern King County all the way to east across the Cascades to Wenatchee and Ellensburg, Douglas, portion of Douglas County even in there, and then South Sound is really where this race could be decided in some of the South Pierce County portions, which is a true battleground and changing demographics there.
So that will be a fascinating race, and as you know, the Democrats, in order to take control of the House, need 23 seats, 2 seats in the Senate. all the predictions all over the place right now about how this may go tomorrow. There are different dynamics in different districts across the country. I think there's some gubernatorial races that people are going to be watching closely as well. I think both sides of the aisle would say that this will be a referendum on the president. It's for the most part happened always on the midterms.
Right? So this is what the definition of a midterm, particularly for the first midterm of a new president, right? And history would indicate that the president in the White House and the party in power loses seats. The question is how many? And we will have our first indicator when polls close on the East Coast tomorrow, and we start to see results come in from the East Coast and the Midwest. At that point, we're going to have begin to get a feel for the story of the night. But, I mean, there's a chance that it could come down to the West Coast, where you have a number of these swing districts in California, several of them in California, and then Washington's 8th Congressional District, as well as a competitive race in Southwest Washington, the 3rd District between Republican incumbent Jamie Herrera Butler and Carolyn Long. And then the 5th District, Eastern Washington, that is a Republican-leaning district, but incumbent Kathy McMorris Rodgers has her toughest race to date, her toughest re-election battle against Democrat Lisa Brown. And if we think back to August and what happened during the primary, Democrats had a much better than expected night. They were expecting a good night, but they had an even better than expected night. That race stuck out as one that was way closer than anyone imagined it would be on election night when results dropped.
So there's going to be a lot of fun stuff to talk about. I think we've been, talking for how long now? 22 minutes already.
Okay, but you
How
know
about that? 22 minutes. Time flies.
Having fun and talking about politics.
8 to 9 o'clock tomorrow. Digital. King5.com. Facebook Live. We'll have all the races. We'll talk about it. Free flowing. It'll be fun. Of course, King 5 through all the day parts, night parts, 9, 10, 11, Kong. We'll be all over.
All nonstop. But again, another plug. If you haven't yet voted, at this point, go to a Dropbox location, or you can walk into a post office. But the reason you don't want to maybe put your ballot in the mail at this point, it needs to be postmarked by Election Day. So you either have to really know the schedule of your mail person, or to make sure it gets that postmarked, or just go to a Dropbox, because they're really all around town now. We have all of that information and a lot of reports and research on the initiatives if you're still undecided, as well as the big 8th congressional race. State legislative races. We have a lot of resources for you online, king5.com/politics, and then also debates and additional resources at king5.com/insidepolitics. So you can find everything there. And of course, as I've been saying all night, don't forget to vote.
And with that, we'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.